The story begins far from palaces, far from recognition and far from comfort. It begins in places marked by distance, hardship, and uncertainty. Across the biblical landscape, the pattern appears again and again. The individuals who would eventually shape history were rarely prepared in seasons of ease. Their journeys unfolded across deserts, mountains, wilderness paths, foreign territories, and forgotten regions. Long before their names became part of history, they walked through terrain defined by difficulty. Their pain was not random. Their losses were not meaningless. Their struggles became part of a larger movement unfolding across generations. When viewed from the beginning, suffering appears isolated and confusing. When viewed from the end, it becomes part of a clear historical sequence. The land of Canaan experienced famine. Egypt became a place of refuge. Generations later, Egypt became a place of bondage. The descendants of Jacob multiplied under oppression. Decades turned into centuries. Labor replaced freedom. Survival replaced hope. Yet even during those dark years, events were moving toward a destination that could not yet be seen. The pain of slavery was real. The burden was severe. The cries of the people rose from the Nile Delta into the pages of history. Yet that suffering became part of the road leading toward deliverance. The route from Egypt to the Promised Land was not merely a geographic journey, it was a transformation forged through hardship. The wilderness between those two worlds became one of the most important landscapes in biblical history. The journey crossed deserts, passed through barren regions, and stretched across years that seemed endless. Every difficult step carried purpose. Every challenge contributed to preparation. The people who entered that wilderness were not the same people who emerged from it. Their pain became part of a larger process that reshaped an entire nation. The same pattern appears in the life of Joseph. His story begins in the hills of Canaan and moves through betrayal, separation, and exile. He was sold into slavery and carried south toward Egypt along ancient trade routes that crossed harsh terrain. From his perspective, every stage appeared to be a setback. The distance from home grew greater. Familiar faces disappeared. Stability vanished. Yet the geography of his suffering was also the geography of his preparation. The road that looked like destruction was leading him toward influence. The prison that appeared to end his future became the place where his future began to unfold. Years passed before the purpose became visible. During those years, pain shaped character, patience shaped wisdom, and endurance shaped leadership. When famine eventually spread across the region, the man who had once been forgotten became the man positioned to preserve countless lives. Looking backward, every painful chapter connected to the next with remarkable precision. The suffering was real, but it was never without direction. The life of Moses follows a similar sequence. His journey moved between multiple worlds. He was born under danger, raised within Egyptian power, forced into exile, and later called back to confront the greatest empire of his time. The deserts of Midian became his place of preparation. Those wilderness regions were vast, isolated, and unforgiving. They were far removed from political influence and public recognition. Yet it was there, away from attention, that his future was formed. The years spent tending flocks across rugged landscapes appeared insignificant. History often overlooks such years because they lack dramatic events. Yet those hidden seasons created the foundation for everything that followed. The man who would eventually lead a nation first learned endurance in places where almost nobody was watching. The terrain itself became part of the preparation. The mountains, valleys, and deserts that surrounded him became the setting where strength developed slowly over time. When the moment arrived for him to lead, he carried with him lessons learned through years of hardship. His pain had not been wasted. His isolation had not been empty. Every difficult season had contributed to a larger historical purpose. The pattern continues with David. Before royal authority came years of uncertainty. Before victory came pursuit. Before honor came rejection. The geography of David's story reveals constant movement. He traveled through wilderness strongholds, desert regions, caves, forests, and remote territories. These locations were not merely background details. They formed the environment in which leadership was developed. The caves of Adullam became places where resilience emerged. The wilderness of Judah became a place where patience was tested. The years spent fleeing danger appeared disconnected from the future he had been promised. Yet those years transformed him in ways comfort never could have achieved. Pain became a teacher, pressure became preparation, adversity became a training ground. Looking at the timeline as a whole, the suffering was not an interruption of the journey. It was part of the journey itself. The same principle can be seen throughout the movements of entire nations. Israel's history contains repeated cycles of hardship followed by renewal. Exile was followed by return. Destruction was followed by rebuilding. Captivity was followed by restoration. The Babylonian exile stands as one of the most significant examples. Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, families were displaced, generations faced uncertainty in foreign lands. From a human perspective, the future appeared shattered. Yet history continued moving forward. Decades later, pathways opened, return became possible. Reconstruction began. The cities that had once stood in ruins slowly rose again. The suffering of exile remained part of the story, but it did not become the final chapter. Instead, it became a turning point within a much larger narrative. Across biblical history, the movement from hardship toward restoration appears with remarkable consistency. This does not reduce the reality of pain. It does not erase loss. It does not diminish the weight carried by those who endured difficult seasons. Instead, it reveals that suffering often occupies a specific place within a larger timeline. The people experiencing it cannot always see the destination while they are walking through it. They see only the next step. They see only the immediate challenge. They see only the uncertainty directly in front of them. Yet history reveals something larger. Many of the most significant journeys began in circumstances that appeared unfavorable. Many of the greatest transitions emerged from seasons marked by struggle. The biblical record repeatedly shows individuals moving through valleys before reaching places of influence, moving through deserts before entering seasons of fulfillment, and moving through periods of obscurity before stepping into moments of significance. Pain often appeared before purpose became visible. The chronology is important. The sequence matters. Preparation frequently preceded promotion. Endurance frequently preceded achievement. The difficult chapter often arrived before the defining chapter. Across centuries of biblical history, the same movement appears again and again. A person enters hardship. Time passes. Growth occurs beneath the surface. Circumstances slowly change. A larger purpose emerges. What once seemed disconnected begins to fit together. What once appeared meaningless begins to reveal direction. What once appeared wasted becomes part of a greater story. This pattern stretches from Genesis to the later historical narratives. It appears in individuals, families, tribes, and nations. The geography changes, the era changes, the challenges change, yet the sequence remains strikingly familiar. Difficult roads often lead toward important destinations. Long periods of uncertainty often precede moments of clarity. Hidden years often prepare people for visible responsibilities. The wilderness often comes before the breakthrough. The exile often comes before the restoration. The waiting often comes before the fulfillment. When viewed from the perspective of history, rather than isolated moments, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The pain was real. The hardship was significant. The losses were deeply felt. Yet again and again, those experiences became part of a larger movement unfolding across time. The biblical landscape is filled with evidence that suffering and purpose often traveled the same road. The deserts, mountains, rivers, valleys, and distant territories where hardship occurred eventually became landmarks within stories of transformation. What appeared to be an ending frequently became a beginning. What appeared to be a setback frequently became preparation. What appeared to be a closed path frequently became the route toward a greater destination. History records the outcome. The journey reveals the process. Together they tell the same story. Pain was present, but purpose was moving beneath the surface all along. The timeline moves forward, and the pattern becomes even clearer. The individuals remembered across biblical history rarely traveled direct roads. Their paths stretched across decades, crossed regions of immense difficulty, and unfolded through circumstances that often seemed to move in the opposite direction of their eventual destination. Viewed from the middle of the journey, the future appeared uncertain. Viewed from the end, the sequence reveals remarkable continuity. The life of Elijah demonstrates this reality with striking clarity. During one of the most turbulent periods in the history of the Northern Kingdom, he moved through locations defined by isolation and survival. His journey carried him from the wilderness east of the Jordan River to hidden streams, remote settlements, and distant mountains. The drought that affected the land created widespread hardship. Food became scarce, stability disappeared. Entire regions experienced uncertainty, yet within that environment of scarcity, preparation continued. The geography of Elijah's story reveals repeated movement away from centers of power and toward places of concealment. The isolation was not accidental. The distance from public recognition served a purpose. The years that appeared lonely became years of strengthening. The same pattern emerges in the story of Daniel. His life began in Jerusalem, but quickly shifted to Babylon after one of the most significant geopolitical events of the ancient world. The conquest of Judah altered the course of countless lives. Families were uprooted, traditions were disrupted, familiar surroundings disappeared. Daniel entered a foreign empire where everything around him had changed. The transition carried enormous difficulty, yet the very environment that appeared threatening became the setting where influence emerged. Decades passed, kingdoms rose and fell, rulers changed, political systems evolved. Through every stage, endurance remained essential. The challenges were not brief interruptions. They lasted for years. Yet those years positioned him within some of the most significant moments of his era. Looking backward through the historical timeline, the suffering associated with exile becomes inseparable from the purpose that eventually unfolded. The two move together through history. One prepared the way for the other. The journey of Nehemiah reveals another dimension of this pattern. News arrived from Jerusalem describing broken walls, damaged gates, and a city struggling under the weight of its past destruction. The report carried emotional force because the ruins represented more than damaged structures. They represented unfinished restoration. The road from Persia to Jerusalem covered hundreds of miles across challenging terrain. The journey required determination, planning, and perseverance. Upon arrival, the reality was undeniable. The city still carried visible scars from earlier devastation. Yet the presence of ruins did not signal the end of the story. The ruins became the starting point for rebuilding. Every stone lifted into place represented movement away from destruction and toward renewal. Progress occurred under pressure. Opposition emerged repeatedly. Obstacles appeared at every stage. Yet the reconstruction continued. The city that once symbolized loss gradually became a symbol of restoration. The pain connected to earlier destruction remained part of the historical record, but it no longer defined the future. Instead, it became the foundation upon which renewal was built. The chronology of restoration required first acknowledging the damage before rebuilding could begin. Across biblical history, this principle appears repeatedly. Difficult seasons often prepare the ground for future reconstruction. The life of Esther unfolds within another setting shaped by displacement. Her story takes place far from the original homeland of her ancestors. Generations earlier, exile had scattered families across vast imperial territories. The consequences of those events continued long afterward. Yet within that setting of displacement, unexpected opportunities emerged. The circumstances surrounding her rise appeared improbable. The sequence of events seemed unlikely. Yet each development connected to the next. What initially appeared random gradually revealed structure. The historical context mattered. The earlier pain of exile created circumstances that eventually positioned individuals in places where significant outcomes became possible. The larger timeline cannot be understood by examining only isolated moments. Each chapter connects to previous events. Every movement influences what follows. History unfolds through sequences, not fragments. This broader perspective becomes even more visible when examining the ministry journeys recorded throughout the New Testament. The roads traveled across Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and neighboring regions reveal a continuous pattern of movement. Villages connected to towns, towns connected to cities, mountains gave way to plains, shorelines connected distant communities. The message carried across these landscapes often encountered resistance. Acceptance and opposition existed side by side. Progress rarely occurred without difficulty, yet movement continued. The geography itself reflects persistence. Long distances were covered on foot. Harsh conditions were common. Travel required endurance. Every journey carried challenges. Yet those challenges became part of a larger expansion unfolding across the region. The routes themselves became pathways through which history advanced. The Apostle Paul provides one of the clearest examples of purpose developing through hardship. His journeys stretched across thousands of miles and connected regions throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. Ancient roads, sea routes, mountain passes, and major urban centers became part of his timeline. Difficulties accompanied nearly every stage. Storms disrupted travel. Imprisonment interrupted plans. Opposition emerged in city after city. Physical hardship remained constant. Yet movement continued. Looking only at individual events can create the impression of repeated setbacks. Looking at the complete chronology reveals something entirely different. Every challenge became part of a larger progression. Every obstacle redirected the journey without stopping it. Every hardship contributed to the broader expansion taking place across multiple regions. The suffering was never disconnected from the mission. Instead, it became woven into the process through which the mission advanced. The biblical record consistently demonstrates that difficult seasons often occupy strategic positions within larger historical developments. This principle becomes even more evident when examining entire generations rather than individual lives. The period between major transitions often appears slow and uncertain. Years pass without dramatic events. Progress seems invisible. Yet beneath the surface, conditions are changing. Foundations are being established. Preparations are occurring quietly. History often moves this way. Significant outcomes frequently emerge from long periods that appeared unremarkable at the time. The people living through those years rarely recognize their importance immediately. Only later does the significance become visible. This pattern appears across empires, nations, communities, and individuals. Long stretches of preparation frequently precede moments of transformation. The biblical narrative repeatedly emphasizes process rather than instant resolution. Journeys unfold gradually. Development occurs over time. Growth emerges through endurance. The timeline itself becomes part of the lesson. Nothing illustrates this more clearly than the repeated importance of wilderness regions throughout biblical history. Deserts appear again and again. These landscapes are harsh, expansive, and often intimidating. They are places where comfort is limited and distractions are removed. Yet they repeatedly become locations of preparation. Major transitions often pass through wilderness territory. Individuals enter carrying uncertainty and emerge carrying clarity. The environment itself contributes to the process. The isolation forces reflection. The challenges develop resilience. The journey reshapes priorities. Across generations, the wilderness becomes a recurring symbol of transformation because it repeatedly serves as a bridge between one stage and the next. It is not the final destination, but it frequently becomes the pathway toward it. The same reality appears in mountain regions throughout biblical history. Mountains often serve as locations where significant developments occur. Reaching them requires effort. The ascent can be difficult. The terrain is demanding. Yet these locations frequently become turning points within larger narratives. The physical climb mirrors the internal process taking place within individuals and communities. Progress requires persistence. Advancement requires endurance. The destination cannot be reached without passing through difficulty first. Looking across the entire biblical record, one observation becomes impossible to ignore. Purpose rarely arrives separated from preparation. The two move together through history. The preparation often takes longer than expected. It often unfolds through circumstances that appear frustrating, confusing, or painful. Yet when viewed through the lens of chronology rather than isolated moments, a consistent pattern emerges. The difficult season frequently creates conditions necessary for what comes next. The hardship is not always immediately understood. Its significance may remain hidden for years. Yet later developments reveal connections that were invisible at the time. What seemed unnecessary becomes essential. What seemed delayed becomes strategic. What seemed lost becomes foundational. The people remembered throughout biblical history did not avoid pain. They moved through it. They carried burdens. They faced uncertainty. They endured setbacks. Yet those experiences became part of larger stories that continued unfolding long after individual hardships had passed. The deserts remained part of the map. The prisons remained part of the story. The exiles remained part of the record. The wilderness years remained part of the timeline. None of those chapters disappeared. Instead, they became evidence that purpose often develops in places where it is least expected. History preserves those journeys not because the suffering itself was remarkable, but because of what eventually emerged through it. The chronology tells a consistent story. The geography reinforces the same lesson. Across centuries of movement, conflict, rebuilding, exile, return, endurance, and restoration, one truth appears again and again. Pain was never the entire story. It occupied a chapter within a much larger narrative. The road was difficult, but the road was leading somewhere. The season was hard, but the season was not permanent. The hardship was significant, but it was not meaningless. History reveals that purpose was advancing even when it could not yet be seen. The final portion of the journey reveals what earlier chapters could not fully explain. When the timelines of biblical history are examined from beginning to end, the recurring connection between suffering and purpose becomes unmistakable. The individuals who shaped generations often spent long periods unable to see the significance of their own circumstances. They experienced events one day at a time. They faced immediate challenges without access to the larger picture. Yet history, viewed from a broader perspective, reveals how seemingly disconnected struggles frequently became essential links within much larger developments. The story of Abraham illustrates this reality at the very foundation of biblical history. His journey began with movement away from familiarity and toward an unknown destination. The route carried him across vast regions of the ancient Near East. Every step involved uncertainty. Every relocation required trust in a future that remained invisible. The terrain changed repeatedly. Valleys, deserts, plains, and mountain regions became part of the story. Years passed. Expectations were tested by delays. Progress often seemed slower than anticipated. Yet those years established a foundation that would influence generations long after his lifetime ended. The challenges he experienced were not separate from the larger purpose. They became part of the process through which that purpose unfolded. The same pattern extends through the generations that followed. Isaac experienced seasons of conflict and relocation. Wells were contested. Settlements shifted. Stability required persistence. Jacob endured years marked by separation, uncertainty, and constant movement. His travels carried him across significant portions of the region. Relationships were strained. Circumstances changed unexpectedly. Yet every difficult transition contributed to a larger historical movement that eventually influenced entire nations. The biblical narrative repeatedly demonstrates that hardship and progress often advance together. One does not necessarily eliminate the other. In many cases, the challenge becomes the environment through which growth occurs. The historical books reveal entire populations experiencing this principle. During the period of the Judges, instability defined much of the landscape. Regional conflicts emerged repeatedly. Leadership shifted. Security fluctuated. Communities faced uncertainty. Yet even within those turbulent years, developments were occurring that would shape future generations. History rarely moves in straight lines. Progress often emerges through periods of disruption. The biblical record acknowledges this reality without attempting to simplify it. Pain remains painful. Loss remains significant. Difficulty remains difficult. Yet the larger chronology consistently reveals that these experiences frequently become part of broader movements leading toward transformation. This principle becomes especially visible during periods of national crisis. When Jerusalem faced destruction, the event represented more than military defeat. It altered political structures, displaced populations, and transformed daily life for countless individuals. Entire generations experienced consequences that stretched far beyond a single moment. Yet even in the aftermath of devastation, history continued advancing. The return from exile demonstrated that destruction did not possess the final word. Reconstruction required effort, recovery required time. Progress occurred gradually rather than instantly, yet restoration remained possible. The years of difficulty did not vanish from memory. Instead, they became part of a larger testimony to endurance and renewal. Across biblical history, restoration rarely arrives without first passing through struggle. The chronology itself reinforces this pattern repeatedly. One of the most striking observations emerges when examining the length of many biblical journeys. Modern readers often underestimate the passage of time involved in these narratives. Years frequently separate significant events. Sometimes decades pass between promise and fulfillment. Entire seasons unfold before results become visible. The historical timeline emphasizes patience because genuine transformation often requires extended periods. Immediate outcomes are relatively rare. More commonly, development occurs gradually through a sequence of experiences that only later reveal their collective significance. The people living through those experiences often lacked the perspective available to future generations. They could not see how individual hardships would eventually connect. They simply continued moving forward one step at a time. Looking backward through history reveals connections they could not yet recognize. The roads they traveled eventually formed coherent paths. The obstacles they encountered eventually became landmarks within larger stories. The difficulties they endured eventually became evidence of preparation rather than abandonment. The ministry journeys recorded in the New Testament provide another powerful example. Travel across the Roman world involved significant challenges. Distances were substantial, conditions varied dramatically, sea voyages carried risk, land routes crossed difficult terrain. Communication remained limited compared to later eras, yet despite these realities, movement continued. Communities formed across multiple regions. Connections developed between distant locations. Networks emerged that linked cities separated by hundreds of miles. None of this occurred without opposition. Challenges accompanied nearly every stage, yet those challenges failed to prevent progress. Instead, they became part of the environment through which progress occurred. The expansion of influence unfolded alongside hardship rather than in the absence of it. The geography of the Mediterranean world became a map illustrating endurance. Every route traveled represented persistence. Every city reached represented continuation despite obstacles. History preserved the outcomes, but the journeys reveal the process. The process consistently involved perseverance through difficulty. Another significant theme emerges when considering how often preparation occurred away from public attention. Many of the most influential figures in biblical history spent extended periods in obscurity before entering more visible roles. Their formative years unfolded in deserts, rural regions, foreign territories, isolated settlements, or ordinary environments far removed from major centers of influence. These seasons frequently appeared uneventful from an external perspective, yet they often proved decisive. Character developed quietly, skills emerged gradually, perspective deepened over time. The absence of recognition did not indicate the absence of purpose. In many cases, the hidden years became essential preparation for later responsibilities. This observation appears repeatedly throughout biblical chronology. Public significance often followed private development. Visible impact often followed invisible preparation. The sequence remained remarkably consistent across generations. The biblical record also emphasizes movement through stages rather than instant transformation. Individuals rarely arrived at their destinations immediately. Nations rarely experienced change overnight. Restoration often unfolded through multiple phases. Growth occurred progressively. Understanding expanded gradually. The process mattered because the process shaped the people involved. Difficult seasons frequently produced qualities that easier circumstances could not have developed. Endurance emerged through challenges, wisdom emerged through experience, strength emerged through persistence. The hardships themselves were not celebrated, but neither were they portrayed as meaningless interruptions. Instead, they frequently became part of the pathway toward future effectiveness. Looking across centuries of biblical history reveals that purpose often operates through progression rather than sudden arrival. This broader perspective changes how historical struggles are understood. Events that appear isolated when viewed individually often reveal deeper meaning when examined within the larger timeline. Joseph's imprisonment becomes inseparable from his eventual influence. Moses' years in Midian become inseparable from his later leadership. David's wilderness years become inseparable from his future responsibilities. Daniel's exile becomes inseparable from his historical impact. Nehemiah's burden becomes inseparable from reconstruction. Esther's displacement becomes inseparable from preservation. Paul's hardships become inseparable from expansion across regions and cultures. In every case, the suffering remains real, yet the suffering also becomes connected to something larger. History reveals those connections clearly because history possesses the advantage of hindsight. The individuals themselves often lacked that advantage while living through the events. They experienced uncertainty in real time. They faced challenges without knowing how future chapters would unfold, yet the completed timeline reveals patterns hidden from immediate view. This is one of the most remarkable features of biblical history. It consistently demonstrates that significant outcomes often emerge from circumstances that initially appear unfavorable. The geography, chronology, and movement of the narratives all reinforce this observation. Deserts become places of preparation. Exile becomes a pathway toward restoration. Waiting becomes a season of development. Isolation becomes an environment for strengthening. Delays become opportunities for growth. None of these realities eliminate hardship, but they reveal that hardship frequently occupies a meaningful place within larger historical developments. The final lesson emerging from these journeys is not that pain disappears, but that pain alone never tells the entire story. History consistently refuses to end its narratives at moments of difficulty. The record continues moving forward. Additional chapters follow. New developments emerge. Circumstances evolve. The timeline advances. This forward movement appears throughout biblical history with remarkable consistency. Seasons change, generations transition, nations rise and fall, landscapes witness countless journeys. Yet beneath these changes, one pattern remains visible. Purpose continues advancing even when immediate circumstances appear uncertain. The people walking through hardship rarely possess complete understanding of where the road is leading. Yet the completed historical record demonstrates that many of the most significant destinations were reached through paths marked by challenge, endurance, and perseverance. The valleys, deserts, mountains, prisons, foreign territories, and ruined cities that appear throughout biblical history all contribute to the same overarching narrative. They reveal that the difficult chapter is often part of a much larger journey. The struggle may occupy an important place within the story, but it does not define the entire story. The timeline extends beyond it. The road continues past it. History moves through it and beyond it. When the full journey is finally visible, the pattern becomes clear. The pain was not detached from the purpose. The hardship was not isolated from the destination. The difficult season was not separated from the larger movement unfolding across time. From Genesis to the final pages of the biblical record, the evidence remains consistent. Across continents, empires, deserts, rivers, mountains, cities, and generations, history repeatedly demonstrates the same reality. The journey was demanding, the challenges were substantial, the losses were genuine. Yet purpose continued moving forward through every stage. What appeared fragmented eventually revealed structure. What appeared delayed eventually revealed timing. What appeared uncertain eventually revealed direction. And when the full chronology comes into view, one conclusion stands above the rest. The pain was never without purpose.